I'm Huon Hooke, and this is The Real Review, and today we're talking to Nigel Sneyd, Master of Wine, who is the Chief Winemaker of the Hardy's Wine Company, which is one of The Real Review's top wineries of Australia for 2021. One of the very best. Nigel, welcome, and firstly, it's not very common to have a Master of Wine as a winemaker. Does that Master of Wine qualification make you a better winemaker, do you think?
Well, that's a very good question, Huon, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you. When Masters of Wine are able to do their 4-yearly get-together at the symposium, they instituted a new series of tastings, which are wines presented by Masters of Wine who are winemakers. So whilst there are not many, there's probably about 40 producers who are also Masters of Wine around the world, either as winemakers themselves or managing partners in wine production ventures. Certainly on the large scale, as Hardy's is as a company, it's quite rare. You're correct, because the skills of a winemaker are very scientific, and the Master of Wine is a generalist. Some are extremely talented scientists, some are historians, many are marketers, they're in the trade. So being a Master of Wine exposes you to wine styles of all sorts from all around the world. And to a winemaker, that is a really important asset, because it gives you, it obliges you to have a very wide view, to consider all facets of wine when you're producing.
Yes, I think if it's one thing in common with Masters of Wine, they all have a global perspective. I think you have to have a global perspective to become a Master of Wine. It's part of the deal. But you already have that, because you worked a large part of your life in France and a large part of your life in the United States of America.
Correct. I've worked for 27 of the last 29 years. I've worked overseas in several countries in Europe and in the US, as you mentioned. So I have that perspective, but it's fascinating. You think you have this global perspective, and then when you start the Master of Wine, you realise just how little you know. And it's a fantastic journey. The more you're involved in it, the more you realise that every day you are learning something new.
And so you've been back in Australia and working for Hardy's for how long now?
It's 2 years for this week, Huon. The first week in November was my first time back working in Australia in 27 years, and my first week was visiting the vineyards we buy from in Tasmania. So it was a very different scale, coming from the Central Valley of California to the vineyards of Tasmania. Could not be two more opposite extremes, if you like.
Sure, but you have previously worked with Hardy's in the distant past, haven't you?
That's correct, Huon. I worked with Hardy's back in the 90s. It was in the mid-90s. And I was employed by Hardy's, but actually worked overseas for the company. I was based at the company that Hardy's owned in France, called Domaine de la Baume, in the south of France, in Languedoc.
A couple of standard questions I've got for you, Nigel. One of them is that if there's one thing that explains the high quality of Hardy's wines across the board, what would that be, do you think?
It's a combination of many things, but I'd say one thing which differentiates Hardy's is that we have a diversity of grape supply through both our own vineyards and contract growers across the country, at opposite extremes of the country. I mentioned Tasmania just before. We source from Tasmania. We source from the highlands of the Yarra Valley all the way across to Margaret River in Western Australia. And our flagship Chardonnay blend, at Eileen Hardy Chardonnay, for example, is a blend from those three regions in most years.
A lot of winemakers and wine professionals have these benchmarks in our heads that we keep returning to as being significant wines that influence us. Can you name one that has always been with you?
But one which struck me at a very young age would have been the first time I tasted real white Burgundy. And I'm going back to when I was at university, and I was absolutely glued to my chair when I tasted the 1978 I was 4 years old at the time. So that was in 1982 when I tasted it. Joseph Huon Claude Blanc. Absolutely, totally different to any other white wine I'd ever tasted. And by then, I'd already tasted quite a few, but I'd never had anything with the layers of complexity, depth, vibrancy, and freshness of that Claude Mouche. It was just stunning.
Of all the wines you make, Nigel, all the wines the company makes and you have a hand in, do you have any personal favourites?
That's a really hard question to answer, Huon, and I do get asked it a lot. But I'll just, within the Hardy's portfolio, our icons are very strong, and I think I have a very soft spot for Chardonnay, having lived in Burgundy and studied in Burgundy. So Eileen Hardy Chardonnay is right up there among my personal favourites, and I've also seen how brilliantly it ages. A wine like the 2004 vintage is still just so fresh, and it's got years and years ahead of it still. And longevity is always a great sign of quality. But then I'll come back to I won't say everyday level, but the less stratospheric levels amongst our wines, which can be bought and enjoyed weekly. The HRB range and the HRB Chardonnay. It's really a baby Eileen. It has a similar sourcing philosophy. It may not get as much Tasmanian fruit, but it gets very good fruit from Western Australia, from Victoria, and it's modelled along the same lines as Eileen. It just doesn't have the longevity.
Thank you for talking to us, Nigel Sneyd, Master Wine, Chief Winemaker of Hardy's.
Well, Huon, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure, and I hope we can spend some real time together sometime soon.